Welcome to another program, Perspectives El Paso. I'm Leon Blevins, Professor of Government at El Paso Community College. The date, I'm going to let you know, is February of 2012. This program has been on for about 4 years. In February of 2008, I had a guest on my program named Maceo Dailey, and also at the same time, a friend of ours named Max Sherman from Austin, and we talked about a very well-known African-American groundbreaker with regard to women in politics, and that was Barbara Jordan. And so I asked Dr. Dailey to come back on the show earlier, but he hasn't been able to get here. And finally, 4 years later, I get him on my show, and it's perfect timing because this is African-American emphasis on Black History Month. Welcome to the show again.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for the long interlude, but as ever, it's always delightful to be with you, and let me thank you for the gracious invitation.
Well, you're such a busy person working in the history department at UT El Paso. Tell me about your position there, and then we want to talk a little bit about your background and things that are going on and what you're researching on and some of your students are doing and so on. Mm-hmm. So let's first deal with your position at UT El Paso.
I am the Director of African American Studies, and I have a joint appointment in the History Department where I am Associate Professor. And basically, I'm an administrator, but I try to wear the scholarly cap as often as I can. And so part of my position will allow me to conduct research and write and do the things that we enjoy in terms of being in the repositories, but a lot of my work centering on planning activities for Black History Month, speakers, and making sure that our minor, we have a minor in African American Studies, that we are recruiting students and we're moving in a way that will enable them to gain the cognitive tools they need, and especially the historic information.
I need to get you then to give us a telephone number, maybe even a website, so those that are interested could get in touch with you and see something about the work that you do, maybe even volunteer for some of the programs that you know are coming up.
We'd be honored to have any input. The direct line into my office is 915-747-8650, and the backup telephone number would be 915-747-7822.
Okay, we want them to know that because we want them to be engaged with you and your programs. I know from time to time you and I cross paths at different events at the Museum of History and other things that are happening in El Paso. What are you working on right now? What's happening with regard to African American history, say in El Paso or Black History Month?
Well, currently I'm preoccupied with planning for Black History Month 2012. The theme is a wonderful one, Black women in American culture and experience. And it's in that context that we've built a wonderful schedule of premier scholars and thinkers coming in to talk about African American women. We have, for example, Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, who's one of the major scholars in the history of Black women. We have Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftall, who will be coming in from Spelman College to talk about Coretta Scott King. We have an array of films that we will show, and we have Michael Hurd, who will talk about Black women in education in the state of Texas. So we have what I think is a scholarly program, if you will, but the popular audience will enjoy gathering that kind of information and looking at these new and interesting perspectives on Coretta Scott King or Black female entrepreneurs. Those are topics which are incredible because I advise my students whenever we delve into history, a fundamental question we should ask is, where are the women? So often history has been written from a male focus, from a patriarchal standpoint.
Sure. There were no founding mothers in America, they were founding fathers.
Yes, yes. And so we try to correct that and create a balanced approach to African American history.
Now, I got something on an email just recently about a gentleman coming in as a reenactor of Frederick Douglass. Tell me about that.
Well, of course, that's scheduled by El Paso Community College,
Right.
and the only thing I know is that I'm scheduled to make some prefatory remarks prior to the one-man play,
Yeah.
and then comment on some of the responses from the audience in the aftermath. And I'm really excited about that because my mentor, Dr. Benjamin Quarles at Morgan State University, actually wrote the first full-fledged biography of Frederick Douglass. And it was brilliant, both from a standpoint of its literary quality, but the scope of it in terms of looking at the life of a human being. And candidly, I don't think too many historians have surpassed him, Dr. Quarles, in writing about Fred Douglass, but we have had some new and recent interpretations and revelations which enable us to problematize the life of Douglass and recognize that he was much more complex than merely being an abolitionist leader and preoccupied with race reform. His reach extended into promoting women's rights. He was interested in economic development, history. He was an editor. And so the opportunity, and of course we have a school here in the black community named after Frederick Douglass. So we note that while this history transpired on the East Coast, historically we remember him here. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for El Paso to engage in thoughts about the issues of African American leadership, because in many ways, Frederick Douglass is the 19th century Malcolm X, and their lives are so parallel. So I'm looking forward to the one-man play.
Oh, great. Now, we don't have to get deeply into your childhood and all of those things, but tell us about what your background is before you came here and how you find El Paso as a place to study black history.
Well, that's a profound question, and I wish I had an hour.
Well, you're a profound person,
Well,
so we can deal with it.
I wish I had an hour to at least reflect on it. But succinctly put, to abbreviate a long story, I'm born in Norfolk, Virginia on July 4th, so I came into the world with a bang. My parents, during World War II, moved to Baltimore, Maryland, where I was educated basically in a segregated school system. But I had a brilliant elementary school teacher named Mary Carter Smith, who is a renowned world storyteller. And each summer she would go to Africa and return with African clothing and tales and all the particulars. And it really piqued my interest in elementary school. I went on to high school and finally ended up at Morgan State, where I got my master's.
Where is that located?
Baltimore, Maryland.
In Baltimore. Okay.
And got my master's in European history and American history. Then I went to Howard University, where I received my PhD in American history and African American history. My odyssey as an instructor, I taught at Smith College, Brown, New York University, and then I moved to Atlanta, where I worked at Dr. King's alma mater, Morehouse College, and received an invitation to come here to El Paso and jumpstart what had been a moribund African American Studies program. And the people who engineered the new interest in African American Studies, actually, Mrs. Rebecca Rhodes and Dusty Rhodes, two of the very prominent individuals in El Paso. So I came in 1996, and I've loved every moment. But to the other question you raise, or the corollary,
Right.
How does one find black history here in El Paso? It's fascinating to look at the complexities of African American history, because in the East, we normally deal with the bifurcation between the black community and the white community. When one comes to El Paso, one has to think about the Mexican American community, the Asian community, the Native American community, and as a consequence, we're looking at a different kind of configuration in terms of race, gender, and class. And in many ways, my contention as a historian is that there's probably more merit to starting black history here in the West than in Jamestown in
Yes.
1619,
Right.
because we have, as you already know, Oñate, we have Africans coming, Esteban, and so all of this precedes the East Coast experience by almost 100 years. And one of our ranking black historians of African Americans in the West has written and argued that, in his interpretation, when Africans were Spanish, because
Right.
if we look at that north-south interpretation, we get a different story, and one that is fascinating, particularly when we look at civil rights and human rights. It's not by happenstance that we had people here in El Paso like Dr. Lawrence Nixon, who brought a case before the American Supreme Court to challenge the all-white Democratic primary.
We cover that every semester in political science classes.
Well, that's wonderful, because Dr. Nixon was a pioneer. He was a humanist. He did an enormous amount of pro bono medical work here in El Paso. And that, of course, there's almost a direct line from his life and career to the opening up of Texas Western College to 12 black students in 1955. And then right after that, almost 11 years, one gets the basketball team, which really opened up college sports to African Americans. So there's much merit in looking at the black experience in this region, and this is not to denigrate what happened in the East, but it's a way of saying, if we really want to look at the black community holistically and in a very comprehensive yet complex way, we have to factor in the experience west of the Mississippi.
And the mixing even of Hispanics and African Americans. You had heard about Henry Flipper before you got here, the first
Yes.
black West Point graduate, and he was here in El Paso for a period of time.
Yes.
Did that pique your interest also, knowing that he had been here?
Yes, he's fascinating. As you know, he was drummed out of the military on charges which we now think suspect, but it certainly is a curiosity that he chose to come to El Paso and launch his career as an engineer, meaning post-military career, as an engineer, as a historian, as an editor, surveyor. At one point, he was even accused of aiding and abetting Pancho Villa, but we can discredit that historically. But his home, or the apartment where he lived, is actually in downtown El Paso. And Flipper, as a representative of what we would call the Buffalo Soldiers, that too provides another vista into the African American experience here in the West.
Wow, it's amazing. Let me ask about some of the places that you have actually visited. You're doing African American history and historic places that you and I have heard about. What are some of the most fascinating places around the United States that you have visited with regard to your field?
Well, Jamestown, clearly. But my preoccupation has really been in urban communities. I'm a scholar of Booker T. Washington, and what I've been working on, the bulk of my academic career, is to correct the interpretation of Booker Washington as either an Uncle Tom or an accommodation, which is the way he's conceptualized. I argue that the man really was a genius. And so for me, I went into sites like Tuskegee, Alabama, where we have now this new movie out, Red Tails, which deals with an aspect of Tuskegee University, Howard University. In New England, I was fascinated to be in places such as Northampton, where Sojourner Truth spent some time, in Boston, where we had the abolitionist movement. Here in the West, to be candid with you, I'm so preoccupied with the sites we have here in El Paso. We have, for example, about 80 miles southeast of El Paso, a small military fort. It's no longer visible and standing, but it was called Fort Quickman. And this was a place where Buffalo soldiers were quartered. The property now is owned by a private person, but boy, if we could acquire that and rebuild that fort, as well as to do the kind of anthropological and archaeological digging, it too would tell a fascinating tale.
I work with Concordia Cemetery Association, Heritage Association, and there's now a new monument there to the Buffalo soldiers. You've seen that?
Yes, I am delighted. Actually, the group that led the charge to get those headstones put up, the Buffalo Soldiers Motorcycle Club.
Right.
And they represent very talented African American men and women, many of whom were in the military. And we've been talking about doing that for years and for years and for years. But that group came in with wonderful organizational skills, conducting the research and doing the homework, getting an input from the city and the military, and voila, we have the headstones, and long overdue. But it actually also raises a question, because when one thinks about the relationship between Native Americans and African Americans in that period, it was a conflictual one.
Oh, yes.
But in many ways, both groups were victimized on the basis of color and position within the American society. And so one of the things I admire about the Buffalo Soldiers motorcycle group is that it's also engaging in a reconciliation dialogue. Because if one would go on a Native American reservation today, we have the problems of alcoholism, unemployment. If one segues into African American urban communities, we have comparable problems. So the two groups need to engage in a reconciliation dialogue. And not only will it improve the circumstances of both groups, but I would argue it would better America, because we need all of our people online to contribute on the basis of their special skills and their special gifts. And so when we look at the Asian American community, the Hispanic community, the African American community, they all bring something special to the table. And if the country is going to remain competitive and grow and expand, we need that kind of input.
With my students over all the years I've taught here, and I've been at community college for 40 years, many of my students, Hispanic and African American, they haven't been discriminated against greatly, deeply, viciously in El Paso. And then when they go back east, even as close as Pecos and Odessa and Midland, and go to Lubbock or Amarillo, and then they run into discrimination. Some of it's very subtle, but still hurtful. And so a lot of the students here don't fully appreciate what has happened somewhere else to some people and how they have to respond to that. So we're aware of that.
Well, I think that's an issue that we're definitely going to have to address. I was at a dinner one evening with the reporter from 60 Minutes, Morley Safer. And when he was asked about the response to Barack Obama as president, he said very clearly and categorically that he thought much of it was driven by racism. And yet when we look at the election of Barack Obama, one of the narratives on the media is that this tells us clearly that racism is no longer a major problem in the American community. And yet we know it is. And more importantly, though, we've got to come up with a definition of racism in our modern society, which will help us identify it, examine it, and perhaps destroy it to the extent we can, because it's really an impediment to our growth and our development as a nation. And if we don't come to that realization, we'll find ourselves outpaced by other countries and other nations.
A number of years ago, a young man asked me the question in class, Mr. Blevins, what do you think are our greatest problems in this country? I said quickly, two. One is discrimination in all of its forms, does so much damage to our society in so many different ways. And the second is drug abuse in all its forms. That means cigarettes, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, anything you want to think about, because it depreciates what we could be, what we could become if we didn't have these two major things. Those I've listed as number 1 and 2 as our biggest problems.
Well, I would concur with you in terms of the two issues. I would add, we need a reexamination of American democracy, and we need to think about what it means to live in a democratic society and how that democratic society can embrace the totality of its population and create a level playing field. The model we were given in the Constitution clearly is extraordinary on one hand, but as we know, it had imperfections, and we've been struggling to address those imperfections as we do today. So I think that we need to revisit the concept of democracy and the extent to which we believe in it, because you can't practice democracy when you're on top and then say, well, I'm losing power or my power is being eroded, so let me jettison democracy. And yet when one listens to some of the rhetoric of the presidential nominees, one gets a sense that if you read it and listen to it closely, that encoded in it is a concept that our people are losing ground, however you define
losing
our
our freedoms.
And so we then need to deal with the outsiders and those who were not here at the inception. And here again, it leads to a convoluted discussion of immigration, border realities. And so we need a new day for American leadership. When Barack Obama was elected president, I wrote a newspaper article in which I said a new chapter has to be written in African American history and American history. And this next election is going to tell us a lot about who we are as a people, because when we look at the ranking problems of unemployment, the economic dislocation, and yet we seem to be coming out of it, however gradually, we want to make sure that we have an equal distribution of the wealth within the American society.
Well, that's what happened when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. He was in Memphis fighting for the rights of those working poor people, garbage collectors and so on.
Well, Dr. King...
I noticed that you have a book. Our time is about gone. A book here. What is this about? You brought a book.
Well, when I first came to El Paso, I worked with my graduate student who now heads up the oral history program, and the first question I raised, what were black women doing in El Paso? And so we took a passage from a brilliant African-American poet named Bernice Love Wiggins, who lived here in El Paso, went to Douglas School, titled, Wheresoever My People Chance to Dwell. And we then went out in the community and interviewed 12 African-American women, and their stories are within, along with a timeline. We have census data, but it was an attempt to look at the African-American community from the optic of African-American women and how they had contributed as teachers, homemakers, if you will, barbers, in very unique ways.
One of my favorite African-American women here, and I worked with her on a commission once upon a time, co-chairs, Leona Washington. Did you know Leona?
Oh yes, I worked with her. She is the founder of the McCall Neighborhood
I've done
Center.
a program on that.
And we worked for a protracted period together. She was brilliant, to say it in quick language. And I admired her because she knew how to work with people and she knew how to get things done.
And she left UTEP a lot of material.
Yes, she left a collection of photographs about the African-American community here in El Paso. And we should note too that she taught for many years. She herself was a newspaper publisher and editor, The Good Neighbor. And without the kind of work she did at the McCall Neighborhood Center, collecting artifacts, holding on to data, it would be very difficult to reconstruct the African American experience. And so she was both an icon in her lifetime and a legend now.
Now passed.
Yes, yes.
Well, we're very close to the end of this program. That's a good way to end it, I think. Unless you have any other comments of something that you think is special we should know.
Well, I would like to invite as many people as possible to come to the Black History Month celebration at UTEP and participate in the activities around the city. We have a rich array of activities, and it's an opportunity to break bread, share thoughts, commune, and fellowship.
We're brothers, right?
Yeah, we are.
It doesn't matter what the skin color,
Absolutely.
the name, the accent,
Mm-hmm.
we're still brothers.
It's the kind of person you are.
Thanks for being with us today.
Thank
That's
you.
another good program for Perspectives El Paso. We hope you'll tune in again in the future and do participate in Black History Month.